From the 1980s down to the 1990s, the Russian Mafia was at its peak, raining terror from Moscow and St. Petersburg to other major cities in the world, including Brooklyn, Los Angeles, and New York. But suddenly, it felt like everywhere became quiet. It was as if the Russian Mafia suddenly disappeared. Did the Mafia lose its sting? Or maybe the government found a way to silence the criminal enterprise. During the reign of Joseph Stalin, millions of Russians were sent to Soviet labor camps, or what were called gulags. In these camps, powerful criminals fought their way to be in charge, becoming vorami v zakoni, a Russian term for thieves in law. Following Hitler's World War II invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin recruited countless prisoners, offering them freedom if they joined the army. In search of freedom, many joined to help out in the war. In the process, they betrayed the codes of the Thieves World, as none were expected to partner with the government. Those who refused Stalin's offer referred to the traitors as suka, which meant bitch, and were treated as outcasts. Soon, the outcasts formed rival gangs in the prison and started collaborating with prison officials, who treated them like VIPs. The result of this separation was a series of prison bitch wars that took the lives of many prisoners. These camps were overpopulated, so prison officials were glad to watch them kill themselves as a way of reducing the population. After the death of Stalin, about 8 million prisoners were released from these labor camps, and many were members of the thieves in law. Now within society, these gangs became even more powerful. The government of Leonid Brezhnev encouraged crime bosses who worked closely with corrupt government officials in a flourishing illegal black market. During the 1970s, the Russian government allowed Russian mobsters to open legitimate businesses. Mikhail Gorbachev loosened restrictions on small businesses, a move that at the time was new because the Soviet Union was a communist state. But by then, the Soviet Union was already on the verge of collapse, and the Russian Mafia had already begun to conduct operations in broad daylight, extorting businessmen. In the late 1980s, members of the Red Mafia held meetings at motel rooms and restaurants across Russia, dividing the country among multiple crime bosses as they planned out how they could take advantage of the post-Soviet world. The Russian Mafia at this point was notorious for its violence. In 1993 alone, 1,400 people were killed in Moscow due to mob-related activities. The economy of the country was poor, and this allowed the Russian Mafia, which already controlled as much as 40% of the economy, to make money illegally. By the 1990s, the Russian Mafia had become involved in politics and even influenced the government. Meanwhile, as the Mafia was becoming more notorious during the 1970s and 1980s, the United States was expanding its immigration policies, allowing Soviet Jews. And with this influx of immigrants, the Russian mob found its way into the country, with most settling in a southern Brooklyn area known as Brighton Beach, a place that is referred to as Little Odessa. This southern Brooklyn area is where Russian organized crime began in the US. The earliest known case of Russian crime in the area was in the mid-1970s by what became known as the Potato Bag Gang. The Potato Gang was a group of con artists who disguised themselves as merchants and told customers that they were selling expensive antique gold rubles at incredibly cheap prices, but instead, they gave them bags of potatoes. By 1983, the head of Russian organized crime in Brighton Beach was a man called Evsey Agron. After the eventual collapse of the USSR, a free market economy that was mainly controlled by organized criminal groups emerged. Many ex-KGB agents and veterans of the Afghan War, which ended in 1992, offered their services to crime bosses. During this period, Russia's vast deposits of natural resources and state-owned businesses were privatized, and former Soviet bureaucrats, aggressive businessmen, and criminal organizations used insider deals, bribery, intimidation, and most often violence to grab lucrative assets. These rich capitalists spent millions of dollars on protection, building, and equipping private armies, led by veterans of the Afghan and Chechen wars. But in spite of all these, since the Mafia was mostly in charge of the country's economy, almost every business in Russia, from huge oil and gas companies to roadside vendors, made payments to the Mafia for protection, an arrangement locally referred to as krisha. Businessmen at the time believed that they needed the krisha because the laws and the court system were not functioning properly in Russia, and to a large extent, they were right. In a largely lawless country, the only way for contracts and agreements to be enforced was to turn to the krisha. The Krisha also used it to intimidate competitors, enforce contracts, collect debts, take over new markets, and even for contract killings. It was also during this period that the Russian Mafia became international. Vyacheslav Ivankov, better known as Japonchik, who was the godfather of Russian organized crime, was sent to Brighton Beach. It was alleged that he was killing too many people in Russia, so he had to leave the country to take control of the Mafia in North America. His assignment was to bring the Red Fellas in the West under Russian control by organizing all Russian criminals in North America. Ivankov arrived in New York City in March 1992 and headed to Brighton Beach in southern Brooklyn. Within a year, Ivankov built an international operation that included narcotics, money laundering, and prostitution. He also made ties with the American Mafia and Colombian drug cartels, extending his reach to Miami, Los Angeles, and Boston. Anyone who went against him was usually killed. Ivankov was eventually arrested, but the Red Mafia remained strong. A 1995 report by the United Nations placed the number of individuals involved in organized crime in Russia at 3 million, employed in about 5,700 gangs. However, in the late 1990s, the Russian Mafia faced a number of challenges that drastically weakened its power and influence. Increased scrutiny and crackdowns by law enforcement agencies both within Russia and internationally, resulting in the arrest and imprisonment of many key leaders and members of the Russian Mafia, disrupted operations. The Russian political and economic landscape also evolved into a more centralized and authoritarian system of government under President Vladimir Putin, giving less room for the operation of independent criminal organizations. Instead, organized crime in Russia has become more closely affiliated with the state and its interests. Although the Russian Mafia may not be as prominent as it was in the 1980s and early 1990s, it still exists and continues to be involved in various illicit activities running into billions of dollars. The only thing is that due to pressure from law enforcement agencies all over the world, their presence is no longer as visible as before. And that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Kindly hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. I'll see you soon.